Basta, è bellissima l'ambientazione di quest'anno.
Avete fatto igual para la conferenza.
Noi. Mi metto qua.
Buonasera a tutti presenti.
Good evening, everybody. Those of you that are here and online following us. The title of the meeting, The Courage to Say I, puts emphasis on the awareness, the capacity of ourselves to become aware of ourselves as a desire for the infinite and a good for the world. This is the secret for every discovery, for every new knowledge, for new knowledge. To understand things in detail, in their ultimate meaning, to give meaning and a name to things. Here man finds the energy to form judgments, not by violence, not through the image of the media, which gives inconsistency, but an affirmation of oneself and of one's conscience, as the gospel tells us. This is what gives us a sort of recompense. We cannot become repeaters, mindless repeaters of others, and say things of which we do not understand the meaning. Society and civilization collapses. The meeting has gone through a pandemic and is here for the whole world. It is here for a world of people ready to say I. We are here to work together, to serve together in a common work. Tonight, we will be helped by our great friend Andrea Moro. The essential condition to say I, the possibilities to say I, is the mystery of language. This is our title. He will explain we must reflect on the uniqueness of human language and how it expresses our fragility, but also our infinite nature and the desire that composes our nature. Andrea Moro is a professor of general linguistics, University of Applied Sciences in Pavia. He's a linguist, a writer. Amongst his many works, He has written The Confines of Babel. And amongst his theoretical books, he has also written a novel. You can find many of his conferences and contributions, some of which he has also given here at the meeting, all online. At the moment, he's writing a book alongside Noam Chomsky, who has also been a guest here at the meeting, and he's one of the greatest linguists still alive today. I'll give the floor to him now. Thank you very much for being here tonight. The courage to say I is a choice, and in order to make a choice, you need to have something that has been entrusted to you. What has been entrusted to us as human beings to be able to make this choice to say I? There is almost a very easy answer to this. We would need in language the possibility of the word I. But we must consider that the presence of language in life does not only allow us to say I, but it gives us a series of consequences and reflections about what this I is. As Mauro said before, this meeting will try to focus on this topic. Let me talk about a personal experience briefly. My reaction when I read a book, I was struck by the impossibility in this story of the possibility of saying I. It is a very interesting story to do with language. What will we do together tonight? I'm going to talk about 3 different roads. I didn't choose a shortcut. I didn't choose shortcuts, and I will try to be comprehensible and make sure I'm understood, but I don't want to be reductive at the same time. So these 3 roads are I and the world. How does the I what's the relationship between I and the world, I and words, and I and the brain? The first one, it may seem that it has nothing to do, this color of the I, which is the title of the first slide, seems almost like it has nothing to do with this, with what we're talking about. But we are trying to explain the meaning of the word I in an essential sense. What is the root meaning of it? To understand I is in isolation, it is like defining the color white without all the other colors at hand. It's impossible. In order to explain what white is, we have to have an idea of what the other colors are. For example, black. If a language can consist of 2 words of 2 colors, black and white, and the color red would be the 3rd most important color. And this depends on the capacity of our retina to pick up on these colors. So going back to the word I, the color I contrasts with the color you. Without you, we cannot understand I. It is you against an I. The emergence of I with you is also manifested in the process of language development and expression in babies. There are many very important studies on this. If we take a young child, if we put them in front of a mirror, what do they see? Another child. They don't know that they're looking at themselves. So how do they understand what they're looking at? A baby, when they're being held by somebody else, they look at the person and then they look away, and they understand that that person is someone different to them. The emergence of the I, therefore, has to happen with a you. Otherwise, it's impossible to comprehend the concept of I. You may be able to see, you may even see this in babies at the beginning. Babies might say, "You are hungry," and pointing at themselves. So babies who are, this is what happens in babies who are blind and deaf. They make this mistake. They don't understand this difference between I and you as pronouns. And this is common for all cultures, in all cultures. But this is not sufficient. Our second point, I as cell. This is a second concept I want to explain. We must understand the meaning of the word in itself. We are all able to, all of us who are able to write, we have been deceived. We have been taught to think that words are like individual cells. They have nothing to do with each other, and the relationship between them is actually, they're very independent. However, words do not live in isolation. They exist insofar as they are a part of a greater system. So a first conclusion in our preliminary, the preliminary part of my talk, we could say, is that the possibility to say I must must pass by the acquisition of syntax. This is the exclusive heart of human language. It is at the heart of human language. Syntax is the order in which we put words and we express our opinion. If the acquisition of the word I comes through, or is thanks to the acquisition of syntax, we have to go to a new point, which will give us a very surprising conclusion, which, in contrast to other sciences, is actually not as well known. I would like to do this in a brief time, in a very brief way, give you an idea of what syntax is. What is syntax? This is an example that I always give. Imagine if I was to ask you to describe this object. It's a piece of a jumper, a sweater. You might say, well, there are 3 colors. There's purple, red, yellow. And then you might describe the number and the frequency of all the lines. What does a scientist do? They take all of these things separately in isolation. They look at the purple, the red point, the yellow parts, and they try to understand what happens, what's behind this sweater. This is what I used to do when I was very young. I used to look behind woven materials, for example. The conclusion is that reality presents itself as elements that are immediately accessible to our senses, but in order to understand them, we must see the connection between them. And this is, we could also recall what J.B. Perrin said. The role of science is to explain what is visible and complicated with that which is invisible and simple. This is this is like a methodological motto which has helped me very often in my studies. This experience is what quantitative scientists constantly refer themselves to. So I'll explain what I mean by this a bit more. What is visible and complicated in syntax? The visible and incontrovertible part of human languages is that words are pronounced in sequence. They travel from my mouth to the other person's ears, through the air, through the room, and they are then translated. We should also think about the translators who are translating me right now. It's a cognitive, very complicated cognitive exercise. If we found 10 linguists, they would never deny this. The most surprising thing is that language is based on the sequence of words, but regulated by a hierarchical structure, a hierarchy. When I try to explain, when somebody explains something, it's always easier when I'm given an example. And if possible, also experiments. So this is what I'm going to try to do. Noun-pronoun agreement is the capacity of a pronoun to refer itself to a noun. Pronouns exist in all languages, and we're going to take an example which should apply to basically all languages. So Peter, is a noun which is referred to he, which is lui in this sentence. This is a minimal couple. So Pietro can refer itself to lui, but we can also change the order. In this case, however, in the second sentence, we've changed the order, but Peter, cannot refer itself to lui. If lui comes before the name, we cannot tie it to the noun. The pronoun can't be tied to the noun because the pronoun has come before the noun. But we also have examples that contradict this. If they call him, Peter will go. So in Italian, we have the possibility for this pronoun, even though it precedes the noun, to actually refer itself to the noun. So we could also make an example. Why have I given you this example? Syntax is not based on the order of the words, but on hierarchical structures. In order to explain this very simple anomaly, we have to go through a sort of a complicated explanation. This is one of the most important works in linguistics from the last century. They're also called the Pisa Lectures because Noam Chomsky spent a semester teaching there, an exceptional period of time that he spent there in one of the most prestigious places in the world. He calls this the principle B of the binding, of the theory of binding. Let's take into consideration that if this is complicated, you will understand later. A pronoun can't refer itself to a noun in its minimal category. The minimal category of a pronoun is the smallest expression that can contain that pronoun. Let's take the sentence, Peter says that he will go. The minimal category will be lui andrà, he will go. The predicate is lui andrà. The second sentence is he says that Pietro will go. So in this case, the minimal category of the pronoun is the smallest expression contained with the pronoun. The third one if we have in the third example, if they will call him, Peter will go. So we have three conclusions to make here. The linear order of the words is not pertinent. The second conclusion, this is a complicated explanation, we'll come back to this. The third conclusion is that this mistake cannot be seen in a very evident way. I think that Hugo will run. The error is very, in Italian, there's no agreement between the verb and the noun, and the error is evident. In this phrase, however, it is not clear that there is a grammatical error because of the syntactical order of the words. So we know that in order to learn the word I, we need to understand and learn syntax. We know that syntax is the capacity, the human capacity skill to compute words into hierarchical structures. And the problem, therefore, is that, the question is, how does a human being learn syntax? How do we learn syntax? There are three logical explanations to this, to how one can learn syntax. The first one is explicit instruction. The second is through imitation. And the third is on the basis of a predetermined biological program. Let's take the first one. Well, we can't consider instruction, education, because the speakers, adult speakers themselves, don't know the rules of syntax. We're not aware of the rules that govern syntax. If, as a child, we hear the word, we hear the pair vendere venduto, we would think that piangere would correspond to pianduto, which is a word that doesn't exist in Italian, but it sounds similar. It feels like that would be the right word. I doubt, unless you were children, unless they were children of two linguists, that the parents would tell them, make sure you use principle B of the theory of binding in order to avoid this mistake. Of course, they wouldn't. We are not aware, therefore, of the rules that govern our syntax. The second one is imitation. Might be a good idea. But if imitation would work if the structures were simple. But if we consider the syntax that governs our human languages, they are extremely complex. And if we used imitation, we would have to allow for a huge number of mistakes. It's like explaining how to derive the square root of a number. If a teacher shows me how to calculate the square root of hundreds of numbers, that would not help me at all to understand how to derive the square root of a number in general, just looking at examples. Charles Young, a scholar who wrote about this in an extensive way. He was very important on this topic. So the only hypothesis left is that there's a biological guide that precedes experience that enables us to acquire syntax. But on this point, we must be quite cautious. We must consider language in the sense that we cannot exclude experience, consider language as separate or divided from experience. Experience remains essential in order to activate learning. All the literature is filled with examples of children who have no experience. Just to quote again the novel that I wrote, I don't want to give away the ending, but at the end, by extrapolating 3 examples from literature, world literature, Greek, Latin, and modern literature, I have shown that experience does not have unconditional freedom. It must move within the limits imposed by a preformed schema, a preformed grid, within, therefore, the confines of Babel. Languages can develop, exist, but they must do so within a certain limit, with certain confines or boundaries. So why is it, one might say, in 2021, are we so behind linguistics-wise? I think that for any scientist, the relationship, the main engine that drives science is a love for philosophy. I think that ideology has served as a terrible obstacle to scientific research. The ideological obstacle, I have found two examples concerning this. The first example is from one of the most beautiful books written on biological foundations of language by Lenneberg. He was a neuropsychologist who made a very important discovery. He was in charge of rehabilitation of patients after trauma or other serious illnesses or strokes or heart attacks. If this trauma happened before puberty, their capacity to acquire their language again was much better. Their chances were much higher if the trauma happened before puberty. Biological search on research on language appears necessarily paradoxical, because languages consist of cultural conventions which are totally arbitrary. And there's another testimony, another witness, which is from the same time, by Joshua Bar Hillel. He's a great philosopher from Israel who was a personal witness from in the laboratory from MIT. What happened during the 50s, as Kaufman talks about in his book, The Brief Century. It's called The Age of Extremes in English. He said that the 50s were the golden age of science because, as what always happens at the end of a war, as war is a barrier to scientific research, let's think about they were able to, in the 50s, open up all these barriers and begin research on in every field.
Con degli strumenti.
And so science boomed with these new technologies of radar, nuclear fission, and at the laboratory in England, which was famous for deciphering the Enigma code, which was used by the Germans to hide their submarine fleet, with the opening of this lab to the world, it seemed like a matured experience at the center of these laboratories. The automatic deciphering of language could lead us in a new dimension of consciousness of the human language. Look at what Bar Hillel says. There was a lab, referring to MIT, and an irresistible conviction that with new knowledges of cybernetics and with recent new technologies and theories of IT, we've arrived at the ultimate corner towards the complete comprehension of the complexity of communications between animals and machine. So first, convention. Second, what's animal and machine? The human element has disappeared completely. The theory of this mechanical brain, this electronic brain, referring to the computer, it existed already before, in the years before the anglicized word computer entered Italian common use. Luckily, things seem to have changed recently, but even on this, it would be the case to be careful, and I'll explain why. So, what must the linguist do, therefore? So, what we're doing now, I'll repeat to you carefully. I is a word that is born in contrast to you. I is a word that doesn't exist on its own, but exists within a wider syntax, and syntax is essential for humans. And how do we learn this? Syntax isn't exactly learnt, it's more the execution of a biological predetermined project. There's a very important consequence from this. From the moment in which the language spoken by your parents does not condition the language of their children, think about an adopted child who is born in Italy, in Bergamo, and grows up in Tokyo. He'll grow up speaking with an accent like that from where he finds himself to be, in this case with a Japanese one. It is evident that this grid that predetermines the limits that determine all experiences, if you take a child, he'll learn every language that's spoken to him by the community in which he lives. In this sense, we can say that the role of linguistics is that to summarize properly the growing mind of children, open to only linguistic possibility. For example, you can learn Italian with traces of different dialects within itself. What comes out from the observations with this is that we're being faced with an immense theoretic revolution. This is no longer a blank slate theory. Learning consists in forgetting grammar not compatible with one's own experience. This is a phrase we associate with Jacques Mellet, a great scientist who died last year, who wrote a lot on some seminal works on linguistics in Europe. And this is a book of his called Human Nature. And it's at the center of this is the role that learning is an experience of forgetting. We absorb a huge amount of information, and after puberty we fix on solely what's most important to us, and that is the structure of your knowledge. It's a great metaphor, but not really a perfect metaphor to be said. So you have everything in your own head, and everything that you don't need, that's left, what's left there is your own consciousness. And we can begin to measure this. So look at this diagram. How do we kind of read it? On the axis you have age, on the x, and as you can read there, and in grey it goes from birth to 1 year of age, and then 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And on the other side you can have the number of connections between neurons within the brain, these so-called synapses. And then you have three phenomena: sensory, by language, and cognitive function. Let's not look at all of them right now. Let's look at that central one, that about language. So look at the shape of the diagram. At birth, begins to greatly increase this curve. The number of neural synapses increases immensely, and then at a certain point it begins to plateau and then decrease. And then at around 5 years of age, it stabilizes. This is about remains to about the level of synapses within an adult. This is exactly the point of learning. Learning languages has to do with this loss of synapses, and this is certainly correlated with how the biology works in this sense. This what we spoke about the theory of forgetting. This is where the brain discards what it doesn't need and sticks to what's most important. There's a famous scholar, French scholar, Jean-Pierre Changeux, author of the fundamental seminal books, The Neuronal Man, which speaks about this forgetful theory. So what us linguists dream of about at night is that of having a kind of periodic table of all the languages. Chomsky said, language is, together with specific sets of parameters, in a kind of varying system in an unwavering system of principles. It's like a periodic table for languages. The number of possible languages is not infinite. Ideally, all languages could be written in a periodic table where they're noted down to their small kind of binary references all together that link them. So let's look at this, the decisive proof. That's what I'm going to try to convince you of. That syntax is the structure of which we can say I is not an arbitrary convention based solely on culture. If languages follow a biological guide that goes beyond, then there must be impossible languages whose structures don't recognize any grammatical structure for cultural reasons, but instead for biological ones. So, some parts of the world, humans eat insects. In others, they don't, knowingly. But, some eat them by accident, but that's a different story. There's a cultural variation. There's no people on Earth who drinks a pint of kerosene. It's not something cultural, it's a biological fact. You will die if you drink it. Here, you can see that the brain can compute certain possible things. Exotic languages, even simple ones, are not almost digestible by your own brain for a very simple reason. If we look at the brain, you've got an experiment here of research where, when I say I in this case, when I say I referring to us, the experiments are done normally in teams. In this case, I worked with a group of German scientists who undertook them, and I owe everything in this case to Stefano Cappa for helping me learn all of this. So this is the experiment we ran. First, we took a group of German monolinguals and we taught them an Italian that contained some impossible rules within it. That is, linear rules. Instead of basing on the hierarchical structure of the sentence, were instead based on the order of words. And we measured how much they improved. We took level of improvement versus the level of blood that was recalled to a part of the brain that accesses this kind of greater net of languages and controls syntax. It's called the Broca area. It's the name of a famous scientist in the middle of the 1800s. And he discovered the role of this part of the brain. So we have capacity to recognize the rules versus brain activity. So we saw for these possible rules, here's what we expected to happen, and it happened as we expected. The better you are, the more blood flows in this brain. The brain recognizes the patterns that you're sending it, a working syntax, and it recognizes it and it begins to compute it better. But on these impossible rules, these linear ones, and they did not know which were possible and which were not, what scientifically and what we were all looking for was this dissonance. The opposite exactly occurred. Once it received impossible grammatical structures, not based on the hierarchy, but on linear order, it progressively refused to calculate it. The level of blood flow decreased. Without properly knowing, they were not in control of this process of you're not in control of your own brain, but completely naturally, it began to decrease. The flow of blood in the Broca area increased, was the conclusion, as the capacity to understand these the correct rules increased, and instead the opposite for these impossible rules. So the selective activation of different circuits in the brain demonstrates the existence of impossible languages cannot be based on the cultural conventions of arbitrary rules, but instead based on neurobiology. So our conclusion is, for me, something I'm quite passionate about, and that's what I'd like to share with you. Languages are not a piece of software rooted on inert hardware, that being the brain. Languages are actually the expression of the brain, as if meat became its own logos. At this moment in all of your brains, the signal you're receiving and the one that I'm explaining is the capacity to, it's not some kind of menial invention made by a person, very intelligent, pre-prepared, invented, and put within us. Just like walking was not invented by a human. It's just something that happens inside all people. The consequences of this knowledge are huge. It completely changes the way we see the relationship in man between himself and what is created, between himself and the animals, himself and machines. So let's slowly move towards our conclusion, and then. So firstly, animals, all of them, have dictionaries of phrases that humans speak. They can communicate even well, but they've got them ready. They don't give a human 3 words. Cain killed an Abel. He can make different things. Cain killed Abel, or Abel killed Cain. Our brain is able to generate 2 completely opposite scenarios. In animals, they cannot. They have predetermined phrases here that they learn within their own brains. So, Ian Tattersall and I, who came to the meeting once, we disagree here, but I'm convinced that even animals have these symbols, what I call symbols within them. To explain these symbols, we could be here all month talking about them, but since, we're connected online, I can't lock you all in and teach it to you by force, so we'll keep it brief. If you put a hat on a chair, that's clearly not a hat rack. That's where I sit. If a mosquito sees a hat on a chair, it doesn't think, no, that's not right. Even animals do that. A cat that decides to pee on the carpet is not a cat that needs to pee there. It's a cat that says, this house is mine. If instead of a cat was there to pass an armadillo, it would go freely. So this means that the symbolic capacity is possible even within other animals. They do not have the capacity to link these symbols together, this syntax. So these implications, it could be that animals have a minimal level of self-awareness, but that isn't based on their own ability to recognize themselves. If you take a chimpanzee, or also can be done with children, and it interacts with a mirror, after a bit, the chimpanzee understands that what it sees in the mirror is itself. While it paints, you draw a mark on while it sleeps, you paint a mark on its head. The chimp doesn't need to realize. It will look, and it will wipe its own head. It's evident that it's understood that the animal in the mirror is itself. But what us humans do is we take this object, this self-awareness, and we make it become an object of itself. That is to say, we pass to a higher level. We go from understanding ourselves to a level of deeper self-awareness. So this isn't the only difference between us and animals. If human language is unique among animals, and on this everyone is agreed by way of syntax, then also our neurobiological structure must also be different. So in the last book Noam Chomsky writes with Robert Berlick, called Why Only Us, who's a computational mathematician at MIT, look at the title, Why Only Us? Why only us human beings are able to do this? And here's a summary of the hypotheses they say. So we'll move quickly on to these machines, because the question of machines, I spoke to you about the 50s. In reality, there's a problem that's being re-put to us now. So before we're solving it, I'll show you a quote by Alan Turing. Turing was a giant, treated horribly by society, which probably hid a great part of his role in freeing Europe from the Nazis. To Turing, they kept telling him, will machines think for themselves? Will they talk? Will they reach their level of awareness? And he probably got bored of this in the end, so he replied like this. The original response, can machines think? I think it's too empty of meaning to deserve to be discussed. Notwithstanding, I think that at the end of this century, the 1900s, the use of words and the opinion of knowledgeable people will be so different that it'll be able to talk about machines that speak without expecting to be contradicted. It's a real bazooka against the contemporary way of speaking. He clearly says machines will not be able to think, but he uses this word instead. So instead of the word thinking, use the word talking. We could say that when you buy a machine, you don't really say that you spoke with a machine that turned on your oven. But this idea of speaking machines is even more subtle. The theories that exclude the possibility of automatic of comprehension of base statistics. Now, if you think about, we go in your pocket, you have a computer that's infinitely more powerful than the ones used by Turing. They re-asked this discussion about thinking machines in a way that I don't think is completely innocent. So they don't make a fundamental distinction. You should alter the distinction between simulation and an understanding of neurobiological mechanisms, the difference simulation and comprehension. And we should not fall in these commercial traps that invent new categories of consumer, like this native of the digital world. It'd be like imagining that certain mutations that initially thought are not actually possible. So here are 2 points that look at our trajectory of what is I. We're understanding that what we need to say I is a syntax that's an expression of our body. We're a millimeter away from an incredible conclusion, but let's take our time here. 2 things are still missing. The idea of lexicon. But I in Italy means one thing, and io in Italian another, and je in French another. Well, yes, it's true that there are different words in different languages, but let me just show you one word I'm very tied to, which is the word to be. The most important is that to be is a verb in most Indo-European languages. If the knowledge of the notion of being depended on the verb to be, we'd fall in a very paradoxical situation. If this notion was intrinsically tied to the verb, it meant that entire cultures would not be able to understand this notion. For example, people who speak Hebrew. But it's evident that this isn't possible. It's a very delicate dynamic, but we need to really deconstruct what we think we know about the verb to be. And there's a lot of work put into it in this book, The Brief Story of the Verb to Be. Another lexical situation example here. It seems like an invention of mine, but he's thought that the determinate article without which in Greece natural science nor philosophy would have managed to have developed, which is a quote from Bruno Selle. If that development depended on said article, there's a history, from the Middle Ages to the 1700s, where without articles, how did things progress? So the European intellect concentrated on certain European languages, for example in Greek, has come from some aspects that, yes, are interesting, but that are not really essential. In the end, the discussion is wider. It's not just on a single word, but on a grammatical structure. So why am I telling you this? If at the end of today, everything became weakened by saying, he told us about Italian, while who knows what goes on in another language, we'd be in trouble. We don't want to have a theory of... we wouldn't have a theory on what it means to say I in French or in English. We want to know what it means to say I as a human for all of us, not rooted in a single language. So what does it mean to say I in every single language? It's true that languages change, much like people are different, but there's no scientific proof that a certain type of grammar means people perceive reality in a different way, nor that it makes people reason in a different way. So there is fake news also in science. There's one that looks to a population in the north of the world, the Inuit people. They have an incredible number of words that refer to snow, and this is actually a piece of fake news that was recently challenged by Martin, a linguist Martin, in 2014. But instead, where there is proof, is that all concepts are expressible in all languages. That is, that no language is superior to another. There are no languages for geniuses, nor are there kind of smarter comments in sillier languages. They say Greek opened the mind. The language Greek opens the mind. That's only the case because we've got over 2,400 years of study on it. Instead of Greek, they'd spoken about the Pavese dialect. We would say that Pavese opens your mind, but that's only because we've had more study on Greek. That's all that matters. So there's one guy from Pavia among us who clearly is happy to hear that. But so what you could take from this, from a linguist, is the worry of making an affirmation that there are no languages better from the other derives from the fact that this chaos of the racial purity of the Aryan race has also inseminated linguistics as well.
So this idea of languages that are more worthy than others was born in that ideology. Let's go to Dante, a comment by Dante in his De Vulgare Eloquentia. In this ordeal, as with many others, Pietramala becomes a great city. It becomes the hometown of the majority of sons of Adam. In fact, whoever has a way of reasoning that is so obscene to think that his birthplace is the best place to exist under the sun, he esteems that, and that who esteems that his own language is the best language ever, and retains that by consequence is the same used by Adam himself. We saw that the color of I, of the word I, we saw I as a cell. We saw the hidden details that the hidden plot within human language, the confines of Babel, and the impossible languages which thanks to which we can conclude that flesh becomes logos. So our conclusion, our ultimate conclusion, is what enables us to say I. The ability to say I is to recognize you, and to say I as a visible entity is specifically a human capacity and it enables him to construct sentences combining words in structures in a biologically predetermined fashion. In order to say I, our brain is not sufficient. We need a heart. We need everything, all of ourselves, in order to say I. Our heart, our brain, and everything, our full structure. Thank you.
Grazie.
Adesso
So haven't got much time left, and it's late at night. I'd like to have you repeat the last century. You quoted it quite a lot, quite quickly. It passed, a period of great ingenuity to try and make these animals talk. How did things go? What were the experiments they did? So it's an incredibly interesting topic. It's a key part of the proof, the evidence. We need to understand what animals should we go and research. A great experiment that comes to mind is one conducted on chimpanzees. 98% of our DNA is shared with them. And in the 70s at Columbia University, conducted by Thomas Behaviour, who's now a colleague of Chomsky, he took a group of chimpanzees. I'm not going to comment on the ethics of the experiment. They took them from their mother and they made them live among humans to see if they would learn human behavior. But since they thought a big problem would be the ability to communicate, they taught them sign language, which at the same time they were able to communicate quite effectively. The result was amazing. The chimpanzees learned individual words. Up to 130, they learned 128 in total, just like a child would. But when they put them together, they didn't really give many major changes. And an interesting experiment compared with, imagine an English child. If you say hat in English to mean, and you say daddy. Hat and here are two different words. But to say daddy hat here instead means that dad's hat is here. So even just these simple words that sound the same, there is within it an idea of possessives. But a chimpanzee was not able to communicate, to understand this idea. It was too complicated for them. The closest we've seen is birds. They're able to understand these complicated sequences, but it's fundamentally a question of memory. So we realize that we are alone and being at this level of comprehension. We're in a really amazing situation of development. So there's a question that could stay from the heart of all of us. This strange union between, just flesh that becomes intelligent, and the way, a fistful of dust eventually reaches its own knowledge. How did a human language develop like we know it? Kind of as a phenomenon, because it's crazy. How could it develop? How did it come up to be? So it's a central question here. It's two sub-questions, really. There's a characteristic of human language that makes you think that human language, when it was born in chunks. We didn't speak about it tonight, but human language is made in such a way that there isn't a limit to the number of words that you can put in a sentence. But in theory, this is why human language has in common with maths, but also with music, the fact that you could produce infinite structures. It's not limited. But this infinite doesn't come in small pieces, it comes in chunks. So how did human language manifest? We think that when syntax came, it must have come all at once. It can't have come in pieces. It's like saying that in maths they invented numbers 1 to 23 and then up to 79 and then on. That makes no sense. Once you've got a bit of it, you have to develop the rest. So how can we know if a population spoke a language similar to our own? And here it's a very complicated question. We've discussed this previously at the meeting, but with Buccellati. So obviously, a way of understanding that of the language was similar is in writing, but writing only goes back 5,000 years. So the last significant mutation of our species is about 100,000 years old. Let's say 100,000 roughly. That means that we've only got, we've got 95,000 years, so we have no idea what happened, what languages they spoke. So I invented a question that I've never really experimented. If you were an archaeologist and you say, I was to show you this, here, a place of where people lived, some humans, but how can you tell from what you see if they spoke our language? Well, some might point to the complexity of their structures. But, for example, look at bees. They build the same hexagonal structures. They're like engineers, and they've done so for centuries. But otherwise, you could say they're hierarchical structures. But, look at ants. They have a queen, they've got warriors, they've got a whole hierarchy situated in their society. So in reality, you can't really tell if there's a language or not, just by looking. You can only deduce this if you follow a community place by place. You see the progression it had, because animals don't know progress. A web is an incredibly complicated object, but a spider isn't born making a better web than its parent. They start from scratch again. It's not like when we're children, we learn the wheel, what a wheel is at 2, what fire is at 5. We grow based on what's come before us. And language is part of this. So I think language is present where there is progress. and their progress always has been. So I think there's a chance that we were born able to speak a language. So I think one of the most incredible ideas that we've heard this evening, the indistinguishability between the brain and the flesh we're made of, and language, our own thoughts, or even our own spirit, if you will. It's an incredible connection, that a way that that our flesh becomes logos. It underlines that there isn't there's no more important subject than here. The courage to say I. There's no more important and expressive example in the Western world than the meeting for the friendship among peoples that together we're building. And for this, I would like, at the end of, give me a few more minutes to remind everyone that all of this is possible thanks to the donators who choose to sustain us. Every donation has a great value. It's a simple gesture of responsibility for this unique place, so that it can continue to be here, to grow and to amaze us. This year we'd like to extend our thanks to the many people who keep us going. Part of the donations received in the 2011 of 2021 will go to the Kampala Welcoming House, where Rose welcomes children often coming from difficult backgrounds. Along the whole Fiera you'll find places to donate marked with this red heart you see in the corner of the screen. And they will go directly or to the specific desks where volunteers wearing red shirts bearing that symbol will be able to collect donations. The meeting is based on this, on donations and on our volunteers, and that is what allows us to proceed and to keep going. Thank you very much, and have a lovely meeting.
Grazie. Grazie.
Grazie a
Però
te.
si è stato chiaro.